It's 8:30 in the morning in Carson, California, part of the LA basin. There's an employee at work busily carrying out his duties. When he hears rapid gunfire in the employee parking lot. He knows gunfire when he hears it, and he knows to get down. When the gunfire stops, he goes and looks outside, and he sees a red SUV with a woman behind the wheel, covered in blood and slumped over the steering wheel. He looks at her, and she's obviously dead.
Call 911. Now.
A shooting in a parking lot in broad daylight. Who is this victim? Who benefits from this death? And who does she know that wants to fill her full of bullets?
My name is Louis Aguilera. I'm a homicide detective for the LA County Sheriff's Department. By the time I was about 7 or 8 years old, I witnessed a homicide in my neighborhood. And at that young age, I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go after those type of people.
Detective Louis Aguilera. He is an expert in homicide investigation. He has handled 350 homicides in his career.
Hey, Frank.
On the morning of October 8th, my partner and I saw breaking news.
You catching this?
On one of the televisions in the office. And the breaking news said that a person was shot and killed. And my partner and I said, well, we're gonna get this case.
He was up, as we say in homicide.
Aguilera.
Next case is his.
Within about 30 minutes or 45 minutes is when we got what we call the official call. And that gave us details of what happened.
All right, let's go.
So we immediately went out there. Once we arrived at the scene, we were briefed by the handling patrol deputy who told us that our victim was a 30-year-old female by the name of Veronica Reyes.
She is known to the workers there. They say she has children. They believe she is married and was apparently arriving for work when she was killed.
Co-workers said they heard the gunshots, came running out, found her.
She was an administrator at this logistics company, and as her co-workers like to say, she was the happiest, hard-working woman.
And we immediately noticed Veronica. She was laid on the ground, and her body was covered with a sheet.
When they see this woman, she's been disfigured by gunfire. She's shot twice in the head. One of those rounds broke her jaw, which distorts the face. Death distorts you as well.
I noticed that she had a lot of stippling on her face. That's the gunpowder and the metals and everything else projecting onto her face. And that's essentially a close gunshot wound. Our suspect was right on top of her. As I walked through the parking lot, there were numerous amounts of shell casings. We also saw that the windows had been shot out of the car, and there were bullet holes in her car as well.
They recover 8 expended casings from inside her car. Now they look at those casings and they are .40 caliber. The shooter is close enough to this car to when those expended casings come out of that gun, they go through the open window and wind up on the floor of the car.
So what do you think? Carjacking gone bad?
Not sure.
You always consider the possibilities as to how and why this occurred. Could it be a carjacking? No. Why not? Too much gunfire. No attempt at car theft. No attempt at anything. This is killing for the sake of it. Carjacking? Not a chance.
We got a second vehicle in the scene.
The patrol officers point out a truck that's been damaged minorly, brushed against or impacted in a bumper area, and then a shrubbery that's been crushed by what probably was a car. Is it connected to this crime? Probably it is.
Have we located any surveillance footage?
Not yet.
The street where the murder occurred is lined up with logistic companies, and logistic companies deal with freight. And by law, these logistic companies have to have surveillance cameras on their buildings. We were told that the murder was captured on surveillance video. You see on the footage Veronica pulling up to the parking lot in her red Explorer. As soon as she parks, a black, it looked like a BMW, pulls up and parallels her car. The driver immediately got out, forgetting to put the car in park.
The driver of the BMW is so intent on reaching his target, he bails out of a barely moving car as it is now moving backwards across this lot. He ignores the BMW. His focus is on who he wants to kill.
He ran up to her while she was still seated in the driver's seat and began firing numerous shots.
He plants his feet 20 inches apart for balance and proceeds to blast away.
The terror that I imagined Veronica was going through, that's what I remember when I first saw the video, was trying to put myself in her shoes, trying to think about what I would have done if I were being shot at.
She tried to put the car in reverse to get away, and at that point it was too late, and the car does what we call a death roll. It just rolled while she was deceased in the car and stopped once it hit a wall.
Then he realizes, once he's completed his shooting, that the car has wandered off, clipped the truck, and is stuck in the bushes. He runs back, he gets in the car, and disappears out of the lot, turning down the street.
You watch videos like that and you wish somebody could just tell her, don't go to work. Don't. Stay out of that parking lot. It's really frustrating to watch.
The surveillance was good in that it showed us what happened. It showed us the type of car that was there. It showed us generally what the description of the defendant was, what kind of hat he had on, the shirt, the shoes he had on.
But you don't have a license plate. You don't have anything that stands out about that suspect. So we have a murder captured on video, but that's it.
Something to look for is that car. So Aguilera puts out an all-points bulletin for a black BMW containing an unknown male who may be armed and dangerous.
The family of Veronica showed up. You have an obligation to talk to those people. It's stressful, but my priority not only is solving the case, but I want to take care of that family.
How can I help you?
Yeah, I was talking to my sister on her cell when she was driving into work this morning, and it sounded like something bad happened. I heard this popping sound.
Suddenly, in the middle of that conversation, the sister hears, "Oh no, oh no!" And she hears loud popping sounds, which we know to be gunfire.
Why don't we go talk over here?
Now, obviously, she doesn't know the end result of that "oh no, no" and that loud noise. Aguilera has to tell her.
Your sister was murdered.
Death notification is a horrible business, but a necessary one. When he does, it devastates her. He has to let her sit for a while before he can talk to her further.
Is there anyone that you can think of who might want to hurt your sister?
Our job as homicide detectives is to not only find out who your suspect is, but you want to investigate who your victim was. And I wanted to get a background right there on the spot, as quickly as I could, what was going on with Veronica's life.
Everybody loved her. She was a great mom. She was a great sister.
Me and my sister were very close. She brought us all together as a great mom, a good friend, an amazing sister. And I'm sure my parents would say the best daughter.
My mother was very, I don't know if bubbly is the right word, but she was a very personable person. She liked people. She loved to dance. She loved to laugh. She had the dorkiest laugh. And it was contagious.
She also shared 4 young children with her husband, Carlos, and she had been with Carlos for 9 years.
She met Carlos in high school, so they were pretty much childhood sweethearts.
Were they still together?
They separated not that long ago. Once she left Carlos, I encouraged her to get on with life.
She started to move on. You could see the independence. I was like, okay, you can go be with your friends, I got the kids.
Started dating. She saw a couple people.
So her sister tells Aguilera that Veronica started to meet other people, new people, in the past couple of months. Well, who are they?
I'm very, very sorry.
And could they be part of this? Of course they could. Because somebody certainly is, and it's somebody very close to the victim. People kill for a reason. We just don't know what reason yet. It certainly could be somebody she just recently started dating. The problem is, who is that? We are trying to determine who in all of Los Angeles could be the one who took Veronica Reyes' life. As Aguilera continues his search for someone new in Veronica's life, he hopes her autopsy will reveal more information.
I've got some results for you, Detective.
We learned that she had sustained 11 gunshot wounds, and 7 of those gunshot wounds were fatal. The fatal rounds came from the abdomen area. She had been shot in the head as well.
The weapon was a .40 caliber Glock.
There's no other weapon involved. There's no stab wounds, no second gun, none of that.
She also sustained a significant wound to the left forearm.
It looked as though it was a defensive wound that when she saw him approaching her car, as she put it into park, she raised her left arm to block whatever he was going to do to her.
The last seconds of Veronica Reyes' life was trying to defend herself, making sure that she was protected so that she could be there for her kids. But obviously that did not work.
We need to find Veronica's husband.
Carlos Reyes?
Yeah.
We have several reasons to talk to Carlos Reyes.
Her sister said she lost track of him after Veronica left him.
Number one, they're not divorced. They're separated. He has to be notified of the death of his wife. He now has 4 children to raise and be responsible for. Secondly, what exactly were the circumstances of your separation? And is he aware of anyone Veronica has been dating? So Aguilera does what every policeman does. You get a name, you run the name in the system. Has he been arrested somewhere by anyone? Has he been in prison before? Who is Carlos Reyes?
Look at that.
Well, when Aguilera runs that name through the system lights up. Carlos is a frequent flyer. Carlos is a gangbanger. He belongs to the Wilmas, the oldest Hispanic gang in South Central LA, who are hopelessly dangerous.
I worked 12 years as a gang detective before I came to Homicide. And the gang culture in LA is huge. Predominantly Black and Hispanic gangs, and they're everywhere in LA.
Let me just tell you, it's a scourge on society. I mean, it is a syndicate. The drug sales culture, the guns culture, the violence culture, and there are no sacred cows.
This area, South Central Los Angeles, Compton and the area surrounding it, is high crime. It always has been. It has an enormous influence of gang activity. There is drug sales and use, and there is violent crime that goes with it. Los Angeles and Los Angeles County has always suffered from gangs. Gangs have been around for thousands of years. The Chinese Tongs, the Yakuza in Japan, La Cosa Nostra in Sicily, all kinds of gangs. They form because they are able to provide something the person is not getting at home, which is love, respect, acceptance, discipline, a sense of purpose, all the things that humans enjoy, the sense of belonging to someone. What they demand in return is absolute loyalty to a criminal enterprise. You're willing to provide that loyalty to gain all those other things. Gangs are a social problem brought on by lack of parenting, misunderstanding, and all the other things that go wrong with society. The results are criminal enterprises. Those gangs in the 70s and 80s made the decision they should be like General Motors. They should franchise. And they began going around the country, starting up little groups of Crips and Bloods and other people to sell their narcotics. And the OGs, the original gangsters of the Crips and the Bloods, became the corporate board members who became incredibly wealthy, selling narcotics across the United States. But a very common thing in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County.
There are a ton of rivalries amongst gangs, but if you were to ask a young gang member, hey, why do you hate that gang across the street? I can guarantee you he won't have the answer. All he knows is he was born and raised to hate those people across the street because they have a different gang name.
So what are you thinking? Revenge attack from a rival gang?
Maybe.
Aguilera begins to wonder, what if Carlos has aggravated somebody from some other group, another street gang, who decides that not only Carlos needs to go away, but his whole family does?
We need to check in on Carlos Reyes.
What if they killed Veronica to show Carlos they mean what they say?
You see gang affiliation on the part of your spouse, you start looking. You start going out on the streets. You get your gang unit to go out and start asking questions.
So Aguilera sends cruisers right away to the Reyes home to make certain there's no gang activity around those houses.
LA County Sheriff's Office, come to the door.
I wanted them to get into that house and make sure I didn't have any other victims. So we sent detectives to his house to do a safety check.
Aguilera.
Hey, Chief.
They went into the house, no one was home. They checked for any additional victims.
Place is empty.
And they didn't find anyone.
I think he has some family nearby.
We found out from Veronica's family that he had a sister and a mother, local.
Go pick him up. I want to talk to him.
And I sent detectives down there to go talk to them and bring them to the local station.
Thanks for coming in.
They both knew when I spoke to them that the murder had occurred. They also were somewhat evasive when I asked them questions regarding Carlos and his whereabouts.
When's the last time you remember seeing him?
I don't know. I can't remember.
Or if they knew anything that had happened.
To his mother, you're telling me you don't know where he is?
It's the usual answer you get from people who don't want to be involved in something. So where's Carlos? Well, I don't know. I don't remember where he went. Really? Your own brother? You don't know where he is? Of course she knows. But she's not going to tell you.
Thank you very much for your time.
I didn't feel that either one of them was very helpful during the interview. So we didn't learn much from those interviews. But as a homicide detective, you have to exhaust every avenue of your investigation. We needed some more evidence.
Detective Aguilera is one of those individuals who leaves no rock unturned. He finds every piece of evidence, and in this case, he learned that one of the responding deputies noticed a abandoned black BMW around the corner from where Veronica was shot to death.
Aguilera put out a be on the lookout for her, and a patrol officer sees this BMW black,
Stormy detectives.
calls it in, and says, I think this is the car.
This our car?
Yeah, it even has the damage on the bumper, like you said.
We saw the traffic collision damage on the car, which was perfectly aligned with what happened at the scene. The vehicle actually still had some shrubbery on it from running into the bushes.
Aguilera looks at it and says, there's no question. That's it. That's the one.
Call the DA for a warrant for the inside. Yes, sir.
This could contain fingerprints, DNA, weapon, ammunition, who knows? It's the shooter's car, there is no doubt. But who is the shooter? Aguilera and his partner get a warrant to search the car. They find beer cans, a bunch of other crap, junk, clothing.
Well, then they notice there's a man's wallet in this car. Okay, this is really strange. Somebody forgot to take their wallet.
They open that wallet, and there is a California driver's license and photograph of Carlos Reyes.
The same Carlos Reyes who was married to Veronica, but that still doesn't say anything. They don't know if there was another person who drove that black BMW.
And it didn't make sense to me that those items were left in the car. Why were they left in the car?
So then they start thinking third party. Okay, so maybe he was held at gunpoint and maybe someone else killed his wife. Who knows?
They also find a receipt in this car for a hotel room in the area, and the receipt is dated 1 day before the homicide. And the name in this receipt is Paige Sanchez.
So now our concern is, where's this female? Let's find out who she is, and let's get to that casino and start looking at some surveillance footage.
So they go to this hotel, and they talk to the manager that was on duty. Said, yeah, she came in, she paid for the room, and there was a Hispanic guy with her.
The manager walked us into their surveillance area, and we were able to see Carlos and this female arriving in the casino. The thing that stood out to us, he carried a metal box with him. It looked like a gun box, like an ammunition box. And it was just the night before the murder.
Then you can see them going to the elevators.
He was affectionate with this female. They obviously knew each other, hugging each other in the elevator. Our question is she involved in this homicide?
Then you see them early that morning walking out of the casino, out of the hotel, and the girl getting into a taxi and leaving. And then later you see Carlos leaving.
Aguilera sees the circumstances. Does he know what they mean? No, he doesn't. And he's smart enough to know that. He requires further inquiry, as they say.
Yeah?
Hi, I'm Detective Aguilera.
When they first meet Paige Sanchez, she's somewhat alarmed at their presence.
Do you know Carlos Reyes?
Yes.
We found a receipt for a recent hotel stay. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about that with us?
We were just there for the weekend.
She seems rather surprised, and that surprise seems to be genuine. Point for her side.
You do realize that Carlos is married.
Yes, I do know that.
Do you also know that his wife was just murdered?
What?
She was upset. She knew they were separated, but she also knew that they had children. And that was a concern to her, that there were 4 kids with no mother.
I've only really known him for like 3 months.
She told us that they had been drinking for the last several days. She said they went bar hopping.
She admits to sheriffs they were drinking, gambling, partying, having a great time. But on the morning that Veronica will be killed, he's up at 7:03 in the morning with a beer in his hand. And they're checking out of this casino hotel.
Once we said goodbye, it was kind of weird.
What do you mean?
She said he seemed as if he was never going to see her again. In the sense like, thank you for everything. I appreciate you. And he made her feel as if that was the end of their relationship.
It was a goodbye that she described as kind of strange. There was a lot of indication that he was going to do something out of the ordinary.
We believe that she had absolutely nothing to do with this homicide, but we believe that he was saying his final goodbye because once he left there, he was going to kill Veronica and he was going to flee.
So they go back to the sister again about the relationship between her sister Veronica and Carlos.
Just have a few questions.
She never told me everything, but towards the end, she told me some stuff.
Yeah, things between them were getting really, really bad.
I know that Carlos stole her bag from her like a week or 2 before that. I know he busted all the windows in her car. That's when we're like, wow, okay, this is not good.
And the sister tells Aguilera that Carlos has been abusive, so much so this caused her sister to file for divorce.
Why do you keep doing this? To sum up my relationship with Carlos, I knew he was my dad, but he was Carlos. I could always tell when Carlos was gonna start fighting with my mom. He would get this look in his face, he would get very aggressive. He would ball up his fist. He was very explosive. He had a tendency of breaking down doors, punching through walls. When he was in a real fit or whenever he was drunk or high, my siblings and I would push our drawer against the bedroom wall and we would just stay in there until he left.
In the process of the investigation, we learned that she filed for divorce approximately 11 days before she was murdered. And that in itself is an indication that she was ready to move on. It's an indication that she wanted to end the cyclical effects of domestic violence.
A couple days after the murder, we processed Veronica's car and we found several things that were heartbreaking to us. And one of them was a journal that Veronica kept. One of her entries had several strands of her hair taped to the day that Carlos pulled her hair out. And she wrote underneath that hair, "Carlos pulled my hair out."
As soon as she came to us and told us what was going on, my husband and I, we gave her the money for the divorce. We helped her to get out
and there were several writings from Veronica in the journal, and one of them said, basically, get Carlos out of her life, essentially. Her notes are get divorced and away from Carlos, make money, live on my own, and change my way of thinking.
Veronica Reyes did all the right things to get rid of Carlos. She did. She thought it over. She made decisions. She obtained an attorney. She filed a restraining order against him.
It's just everything you tell a woman to do who's a victim of domestic violence.
She had had it. She was done. She was moving on with her life.
Veronica did everything she could. It was not enough. Two and two still makes four the last time I checked. Carlos is a gangbanger, which means he's got all the skills and all the necessary temperament to blast her to kingdom come. Aguilera gets his cell phone records.
We start getting alerts that his phone is on the 5 freeway going southbound.
Interstate 5 covers north to south most of California. It's humongous. And it is the gateway to Mexico. It's obvious what he's doing.
And if he got to Mexico, we were concerned that we would never find him again.
He is trying to disappear into Mexico. If he crosses into that world, he may as well be in the cosmos. The hunt is now on for Carlos Reyes for first-degree murder. Aguilera gets his phone records, and it pings going south on I-5. And it pings stop at the border crossing at San Ysidro.
Now we have to do an alert.
I need to put out an APB.
And notify the authorities at the border. Hey, look for this person.
It's Carlos Reyes.
Here's a DMV photo. If you see him, please detain him for us. We didn't have confirmation that he actually made it, but we were pretty certain that he did. And the concern was that it's such a big country. There's so many places to hide, and we would never see him again.
At this point, all Aguilera can do is wait. But a Sheriff's Department gang unit detective knocks on his door.
Hey, might have some information for you.
What you got?
And the gang detective said, hey, I have an informant, and this informant knows where your suspect is at.
There are confidential informants who are in the business of making a little extra cash. They're not going to go to court. They're just going to tell you what's happening.
Yeah, you got caught the red light.
No kidding.
Once you go through the Mexican border, you either get a red light or a green light. It just randomly pops up.
And once they decide to search your car, they're going to find what's in it. They are not good at it. They are experts at it. They'll find your concealed compartment inside your gas tank. They'll find everything. And a weapon was found in a hidden compartment behind the stereo in his car.
The agents arrested him for bringing a firearm into Mexico.
The guy they stopped was called Arturo Lopez.
Lopez?
Yeah.
Our guy's called Carlos Reyes.
So is it Carlos Reyes or not? The informant says it is. Informants say a lot of things. But is this reliable? That's when Aguilera gets a hold of an agent that he knows and says, can you find this guy in jail?
Guillermo, it's Luis Aguilera.
I contacted Special Agent Guillermo Ion. He is an expert at tracking down people in Mexico. He has contacts in Mexico that we don't.
And thinking that maybe a different name was used, we started comparing all the individuals that had been detained or arrested for that suspected day, and eventually we found him under a different alias.
It was a really short turnaround where Guillermo said, I found your guy. He sent us the booking photo from Mexico. There was no doubt in our mind that the booking photo from Mexico was Carlos Reyes.
At the border, when that agent searched the car, the driver identified himself as Arturo Lopez. Not only does he get stopped, he provides false ID because he knows he's being looked for. Well, guess what, Carlos? You just got found.
I was thrilled, but I was concerned that we're now dealing with Mexico. He was sentenced that week to 5 years in prison.
Mexico is incredibly strict about its gun laws. You try to bring a gun illegally into Mexico, you will pay a price. They do not dance around. It's not a welcome wagon, like, come on in, American detectives, we'll do everything we can to help.
And I was upset at it, but I know there was nothing that we had that was gonna bring him from his prison sentence in Mexico. Would we ever get Carlos back to the States?
Aguilera needs that gun to run some tests and connect it to Veronica's murder. The problem is that gun is in Mexico, and the Mexican authorities are less than cooperative.
Is this gun that was found on the defendant the same gun that killed Veronica Reyes?
The firearms recovered at the border go to their military.
That gun was in the evidence locker of the Mexican military in Mexico here in Tijuana.
When we go down there, we have to make sure it's our murder weapon by firing it, bringing back the bullets and the casings to compare it to what we have here in LA.
They had a common process that is used. In this case, they used telephone books, the old traditional yellow telephone books that we all have.
Now, way back in the day, ballistics tests were performed with phone books. They'll stop bullets. But in the modern day, they don't have phone books. Except in Mexico, they still do. So the ballistics guy goes old school. And the ballistics man puts 3 phone books in a cardboard box and fires a round into the phone books. Boom! Into the box. Gets into that 3rd book, there's his bullet. It'll go through 2, but it won't go through 3. So unconventional, yes, but it works.
We then retrieved the casings and the bullets, and we took those samples back to the United States for comparison.
I remember driving back from Mexico, all of us, with the ballistic evidence and just hoping this has to be our murder weapon.
They compare the ballistics to the bullets removed from the victim.
So it was important to see the pattern that was on the bullet and see that the pattern matched what they found at the crime scene. It's sort of like a fingerprint.
Okay. Thank you.
I remember getting a phone call saying, hey, Louis, just want you to know, I am 100% certain it's your gun. Coupled with the evidence we built to that day, now we have him arrested with our murder weapon, made me feel a lot better about the case.
You look back over the events in this case, and you begin to get a very good idea of what took place. Veronica Reyes meets a man, Carlos Reyes. They marry. Progressively, his abusive personality begins to be exposed. It starts off verbally, making comments. Then the pushing and shoving happens. Then the slapping begins. And Veronica decides this is no way to live. She files for divorce.
And that is the ultimate slap in the face. For her to take that step and file for divorce, I think set him off.
Carlos is what he is. He's an abusive male. And abusive males have another feature of their personality. If I can't have you, nobody's gonna have you. You insulted me by divorcing me. I'm gonna take you out. He suffers emotionally when he's served. What's his response? Alcohol. Female companionship. But the alcohol grinds on him, lowers his level of inhibition.
The partying was just a cover for how mad he was. So I'm gonna hang out with this woman for 3 days, and we're gonna have a big party, and I won't think about it. But then she keeps creeping into his mind, and he gets angrier and angrier.
Thinking about nothing but Veronica until it arrives at an emotional crescendo. He gets in that car, and he knows where to find her, and he shows up too.
We think he probably arrived at the scene early in case Veronica arrived to work early and just waited for her car to show up in that parking lot. She pulls up to her work, which should be a safe place. And she's killed by her husband, the father of her children. And then he flees to Mexico.
And is he really that stupid that he would leave a car registered to himself and his wallet in the car?
Mexico was not going to release him to our custody until he served those 5 years in prison. So now my concern is, how are we going to keep track of someone in a Mexican prison for 5 years?
Reyes, utilizing the level of corruption in the Mexican penal system, pays off guards to keep getting him transferred to different jails to make him more difficult to find.
Now the fear was making sure that Mr. Reyes did not potentially bribe his way out of jail, right? We're checking in with the warden, and they got to the point where I'll let you know if anything happens, but he's still here.
Eventually, as the release date neared, we made contact with our Major Crimes Bureau extradition team to work out the logistics of flying him back to the States.
They basically snatched him up from that prison, and then he's flown back from Mexico City to the United States in the custody of a U.S. Marshal.
I knew I wanted to be there when he arrived at the airport. Our major crimes team brought him off the airplane, and myself and my partner took custody of him at LAX. He didn't seem upset. He didn't seem sad, remorseful, nothing. Just as a matter of fact.
Welcome home, Reyes.
When do I go to court, was his question. And then we took him to a local station where we booked him for murder. Carlos was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder, stalking, the use of the firearm, and he was ultimately sentenced to 55 years to life.
This crime occurred on October the 8th of 2008. He isn't sentenced in a U.S. court until 2015, 7 years later.
Learning to cope, learning to be okay is something that I do every day, which is also why I wear her necklace, so that she feels closer to me, and it's how I feel closer to her. Because being without her is very, very hard. It hurt.
We pulled out money from our 401k, got a house that would house everybody.
April 12th, 1981, began like countless quiet Sunday mornings in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The first light crept over the pine-covered ridges surrounding the tiny community of Keddie, California, turning the tops of the trees into pale streaks of gold while the valley below remained wrapped in cool shadows. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil, pine needles, and wood that had absorbed decades of rain and snow. Nothing about the morning suggested that history had already changed during the night. Keddie was the kind of place people often overlooked on a map. A small railroad town hidden among forests and winding mountain roads, it attracted families looking for inexpensive cabins, seasonal workers, and people hoping to leave difficult chapters of their lives behind. Visitors came searching for peace. Some stayed because life had quietly settled around them. Others came because there seemed to be nowhere else to go. Among them was a woman named Sue Sharp. She had come to Keddy carrying something heavier than furniture or moving boxes. She carried 6 children, a marriage that had fallen apart, and the hope that isolation might become healing. Cabin 28 was never meant to be a dream home. It was simply affordable. It offered enough bedrooms for her children, enough distance from the life she wanted to escape, and enough privacy to believe that tomorrow could be different from yesterday. For nearly 2 years, that belief seemed possible. Neighbors saw children riding bicycles through the dirt roads connecting the cabins. They remembered laughter drifting between the trees during warm afternoons. They remembered the familiar sight of Sue trying to hold together a household that, while imperfect, still felt alive. Nothing about Cabin 28 appeared extraordinary. Until one spring night. There are crimes that horrify because of their brutality. There are mysteries that endure because investigators never uncover every answer. And then there are the rare cases that become something else entirely, stories that seem to resist explanation no matter how much time passes. The Keddy cabin murders belong to that last category. More than 4 decades later, investigators, journalists, retired detectives, and true crime researchers continue returning to the same cabin, the same photographs, the same witness statements, and the same unanswered questions. Every few years another piece of evidence surfaces. Another theory gains attention. Another name is whispered as the possible killer. Yet the central mystery refuses to disappear. Who entered Cabin 28 that night? Why were some people inside murdered with unimaginable violence while 3 children sleeping only a few feet away survived completely unharmed? Why did one 12-year-old girl vanish into the darkness, only for fragments of her remains to be discovered years later many miles from home? And perhaps most disturbing of all, did the people responsible spend the rest of their lives walking freely through ordinary days while the victims became nothing more than fading newspaper headlines? The questions linger because the silence surrounding them has never truly been broken. When people picture crime scenes, they often imagine flashing police lights, detectives rushing to preserve evidence, and neighborhoods instantly sealed off behind yellow tape. Reality is often far less orderly. In Keddy, confusion arrived before certainty. Fear arrived before answers. Mistakes arrived before justice. By the time investigators began understanding what they were looking at, some of the most valuable evidence may already have been lost forever. But none of that was known when the morning began. Just after sunrise, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp started walking back toward Cabin 28 after spending the previous night with friends nearby. It was not unusual. Children in Keddy wandered freely between cabins. Parents knew one another. The resort community felt safe enough that a teenager walking home alone on a Sunday morning barely deserved a second thought. The dirt beneath her shoes was still damp from the cool mountain night. Pine branches swayed gently overhead as sunlight slowly filtered through the forest canopy. Somewhere in the distance, a train echoed through Feather River Canyon, a familiar sound that had become part of daily life for everyone living there. Nothing warned her to stop walking. Nothing told her that home no longer existed in the way she had left it only hours earlier. The front door stood before her exactly where it always had. The windows looked ordinary. The surrounding cabins sat quietly beneath the trees. If someone had driven past at that exact moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. Evil rarely announces itself. Sometimes it waits behind an unlocked door. Sometimes it hides inside familiar walls until the first person unknowingly walks straight into its aftermath. When Sheila stepped inside Cabin 28, the world she recognized disappeared forever. The room before her was no longer a living room. It had become the final stage of unimaginable violence. Her mother, Sue Sharp, lay motionless. Nearby was her 15-year-old brother, John. Close to him was John's 17-year-old friend, Dana Wingate. The 3 bodies rested in terrible silence, their final moments frozen inside a cabin that only hours earlier had been filled with ordinary family life. Furniture had been moved. Objects lay scattered. Evidence of desperate struggle filled the room. The violence suggested rage far beyond robbery or random attack. This had been personal. Or at least it had felt personal to whoever stood inside that cabin during the night. As horrifying as the scene already was, investigators would soon realize an even stranger truth. One family member was missing. 12-year-old Tina Sharp had vanished. There were no signs that she had escaped safely into the woods. No note. No explanation. No indication whether she had fled, been taken, or somehow survived. She was simply gone. At the same time, another impossible discovery waited behind a closed bedroom door. Inside, Rick Sharp, Greg Sharp, and their friend Justin Smart had spent the night sleeping. None of them had been murdered. None of them had suffered serious physical injuries. Whether they slept through the nightmare, heard only fragments of what happened, or remembered more than they could later explain would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the entire investigation. Imagine that for a moment. Separated from unimaginable violence by nothing more than a wall. 3 children alive. 3 victims dead. 1 child missing. The arithmetic itself feels impossible. Investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct every minute of that night, measuring blood patterns, studying footprints, comparing witness statements, examining weapons, and revisiting interviews that seemed insignificant at first. Yet every answer appeared to create 2 new questions. Why had the killers left witnesses alive? Why had Tina disappeared? Why did certain suspects seem to attract attention almost immediately, only to avoid prosecution year after year? Why did critical evidence remain overlooked until decades later? And perhaps most frustrating of all, how could such an extraordinarily violent crime unfold inside a small community where neighbors lived only a short distance away? The deeper one looks into the Keddy murders, the less the case resembles a straightforward homicide investigation. Instead, it begins to resemble a maze built from fear, damaged memories, investigative mistakes, conflicting testimonies, and secrets that some people may have carried to their graves. Time should have made the story clearer. Instead, time only exposed more cracks. Witnesses changed their recollections. Potential suspects died. Physical evidence deteriorated. Rumors multiplied. Documents disappeared. New forensic technology uncovered possibilities that detectives in 1981 could never have imagined, yet even modern science has failed to deliver the certainty that the victims deserved. Every generation discovers this case believing it might finally solve the mystery. Every generation leaves with the same haunting realization. Some crimes are not remembered because they were solved. They are remembered because they continue asking questions long after everyone expected the answers to exist. This is not simply the story of a murder. It is the story of an ordinary family searching for a fresh start in a quiet mountain town. It is the story of one night that shattered that hope forever. It is also the story of an investigation whose failures became almost as infamous as the crime itself, leaving behind a wound that has never fully healed. More than 45 years have passed since the lights inside cabin 28 went dark. The forest has continued to grow. The cabins have changed. Children who were not yet born when the murders occurred have become adults. Yet somewhere between the whispering pines and the fading memories of those who were there, the unanswered questions remain, waiting for someone capable of finally bringing light into one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The passage of time has a peculiar way of softening memories. Faces become blurred. Voices fade. Entire decades collapse into a handful of photographs tucked inside forgotten boxes. But some places seem to reject time altogether. They remain suspended in a single moment, as though history itself refuses to move forward. For many people, Cabin 28 became one of those places. Long before anyone spoke of documentaries, podcasts, or internet forums dedicated to unsolved crimes, investigators stood inside that modest wooden cabin trying to understand what they were seeing. Every glance around the room raised another impossible question. Every object seemed to tell part of a story while refusing to reveal the ending. The walls could not explain who had entered. The furniture could not explain who had fought. The silence could not explain why. Years later, detectives would admit that this was not merely a difficult investigation. It was the kind of case that followed them home. They would wake in the middle of the night replaying photographs they had seen hundreds of times. They would revisit old witness interviews hoping a forgotten sentence might suddenly carry new meaning. They would spread evidence across their desks decades after retirement, still convinced that the truth had to be hiding somewhere inside details everyone else had overlooked. Because the truth, when examined closely, never completely disappeared. It simply became buried beneath mistakes, assumptions, and the relentless passage of time. If this story had ended with a solved investigation, the names inside it might have slowly faded into local history. Instead, they became part of one of America's most enduring mysteries. The victims never had the opportunity to tell investigators what happened inside cabin 28. The survivors were children. Some witnesses contradicted themselves. Some suspects died before they could answer lingering questions. And some pieces of evidence seemed to wait patiently for advances in forensic science that would not exist until decades later. It is tempting, when looking backward, to believe that every mystery eventually finds its answer. Popular stories often promise that patience will uncover justice. That persistence always defeats secrecy. Real life offers no such guarantees. Sometimes justice arrives too late. Sometimes it arrives incomplete. And sometimes it never arrives at all. That uncomfortable reality is precisely what makes the Keddie cabin murders so haunting. This case is not frightening because of a ghost story or an urban legend hidden in the California mountains. It is frightening because everything about it happened to ordinary people living ordinary lives. There was no warning that cabin 28 would become infamous. There was no sign posted at the entrance of the resort suggesting that one family was counting down the final hours of their lives together. The evening before the murders began like thousands of other evenings. Children visited friends. Teenagers made casual plans. Neighbors settled into their homes. Lights glowed warmly through cabin windows while darkness slowly settled over the surrounding forest. Somewhere nearby, conversations drifted into the cool spring air before disappearing beneath the towering pines. Nothing about that night appeared extraordinary. If you had driven through Keddie after sunset, you would have seen little more than a peaceful mountain community preparing for another quiet Sunday. That image is important to remember. Because evil almost never arrives with dramatic music or obvious warning signs. It often enters quietly. It wears familiar faces. It waits until routines become predictable. Then, in a matter of minutes, it tears apart lives that took years to build. For Sue Sharp, moving to Keddie represented something many single parents understand all too well, the determination to create stability after chaos. Raising 6 children was never going to be easy. Every day required balancing responsibilities that most people could scarcely imagine. Bills had to be paid. Meals had to be prepared. Arguments had to be settled. School schedules, friendships, growing pains, and countless ordinary challenges filled each week. Life was not perfect. But perfection was never the goal. Safety was. Hope was. The belief that tomorrow could offer something better than yesterday was enough reason to keep going. That hope makes what happened inside cabin 28 all the more devastating. Because whoever entered that home did not simply take lives. They destroyed the sense of security that every family depends upon. Even now, decades later, investigators continue debating what motivated the attack. Was it personal? Was it revenge? Did the killers intend to target Sue Sharp from the beginning? Or did events inside the cabin spiral into violence that no one had anticipated? These questions remain unanswered, not because detectives failed to ask them, but because the evidence has never pointed confidently in one direction. Instead, the case exists in a strange space between certainty and speculation. There are facts. There are theories. And separating one from the other has become increasingly difficult as the years have passed. That is why this story deserves patience. Not every rumor deserves belief. Not every popular theory deserves acceptance. Throughout the years, countless books, television programs, newspaper articles, and online discussions have attempted to solve the mystery. Some identify obvious suspects. Others imagine elaborate conspiracies involving multiple people, hidden motives, or official corruption. A few claim the answers have been obvious from the very beginning. Reality is rarely that simple. The available evidence does suggest that investigators eventually focused significant attention on certain individuals. Some statements appeared deeply suspicious. Some behavior raised troubling questions. Certain discoveries made years later seemed to reinforce suspicions that had existed almost from the start. Yet suspicion is not proof. In any criminal investigation, especially one that remains officially unsolved, there is an important distinction between what investigators believe, what evidence supports, and what a court of law could establish beyond reasonable doubt. That distinction matters. Because while this story explores the darkest corners of human behavior, it also reminds us that justice depends upon evidence rather than assumption. As we move deeper into the events surrounding Cabin 28, there will be moments that seem almost impossible to believe. There will be coincidences that feel too convenient. Decisions made by investigators will leave you wondering how critical opportunities slipped away. Witness statements will contradict one another so dramatically that separating memory from imagination becomes nearly impossible. Yet every twist, every unanswered question, and every frustrating dead end contributes to understanding why this case continues to fascinate investigators more than 4 decades later. It is easy to imagine mysteries as puzzles waiting for the final missing piece. The Keddy case is different. Imagine opening a puzzle box only to discover that some pieces are missing, others belong to an entirely different picture, and several have been damaged beyond recognition. Then imagine being told that the completed image may determine who committed one of California's most notorious unsolved crimes. That is the challenge investigators faced. And in many ways, it is the challenge that remains today. Because somewhere inside the fragments of evidence, fading memories, and overlooked details lies the story of what truly happened during those final hours inside Cabin 28. A story that begins not with the murders themselves, but with a quiet mountain community where trust still existed, where children still believed home was the safest place they could be, and where one family believed they had finally found a chance to start over. Before fear arrived. Before headlines spread across the country. Before detectives filled notebooks with unanswered questions. There was simply a family living an ordinary Saturday. And like every great mystery, the ending cannot be understood until we first understand everything that came before. In the next chapter, we step away from the crime scene and into the lives of the people whose stories were forever frozen by one spring night in 1981. There is a tendency, especially in cases that remain unsolved for decades, to remember only the mystery. The victims slowly become names printed beneath old newspaper headlines. Their photographs are reduced to evidence exhibits. Their lives are compressed into a single tragic sentence, as if everything they were before that night no longer mattered. But every unsolved case begins long before detectives arrive. Long before police reports. Long before courtroom speculation. Long before theories circulate across television screens and internet forums. It begins with ordinary people. People who laughed at family jokes no one else would understand. People who argued over chores, forgot birthdays, made plans for the following week, and assumed there would always be another tomorrow. That is what makes the Keddy Cabin murders so profoundly unsettling. Nothing about the Sharp family suggested they were living through the final chapter of their story. Their home was modest. Their lives were complicated, as most families' lives are. Their future remained unwritten. Then, within a single night, everything changed. Even now, more than 4 decades later, the case continues to leave behind questions that refuse to fade. How could such extraordinary violence unfold without waking an entire neighborhood? Why did some children survive while others did not? What happened to Tina Sharp after she disappeared into the darkness? Who carried those secrets for years afterward? And perhaps the question that haunts investigators most deeply: how close did they come to solving the case before crucial opportunities slipped through their fingers forever? Those questions have become the foundation of countless investigations, books, interviews, and documentaries. New forensic techniques have breathed fresh life into evidence that once appeared useless. Retired detectives have revisited forgotten reports. Independent researchers have spent years comparing timelines, photographs, and witness statements, hoping to discover something everyone else overlooked. Each generation believes it might finally be the one to uncover the truth. Yet the mystery survives. Not because people stopped looking, but because every answer seems to expose another unanswered question waiting beneath it. Perhaps that is why the Keddie case continues to resonate so deeply. It reminds us that justice is not inevitable. It reminds us that investigations depend upon human decisions, and humans are capable of overlooking details, making assumptions, or arriving too late. It reminds us that a single mistake made during the first hours of an investigation can echo across decades. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every mystery are real families who never stopped waiting for certainty. For the surviving members of the Sharp family, this was never simply an unsolved crime discussed by strangers. It was the day childhood ended. The day ordinary memories became priceless because no new ones would ever be created. The day every birthday, every holiday, and every family gathering would forever include empty spaces that could never be filled. While the public searched for answers, the survivors carried something even heavier. They carried absence. The absence of a mother. The absence of siblings. The absence of knowing exactly why. No investigation, regardless of its outcome, can truly erase that kind of loss. As we move forward through this story, we will examine the available evidence with care. We will distinguish established facts from theories and speculation. We will follow the investigation as it unfolded, including the moments when detectives believed they were finally approaching the truth and the moments when that truth slipped away once again. Because this story deserves more than sensational headlines. It deserves patience. It deserves accuracy. And above all, it deserves remembrance of the people whose lives were taken long before the mystery became famous. The forests surrounding Keddie have remained remarkably unchanged since 1981. Pine trees continue to sway in the mountain wind. The Feather River still cuts through the canyon below. Trains still pass along the tracks that once echoed through the quiet resort community. Nature has continued exactly as it always has, indifferent to the tragedy that unfolded beneath its towering branches. Human memory, however, has not been so quiet. For decades, investigators have returned to faded photographs. Journalists have retraced forgotten roads. Former residents have recalled fragments of conversations that once seemed insignificant. Some have wondered whether they unknowingly crossed paths with the people responsible. Others have questioned whether the truth was always hiding in plain sight. The longer one studies the Keddie cabin murders, the more one realizes that this is not merely the story of an unsolved homicide. It is the story of hope interrupted, of trust broken, of an investigation forever shadowed by missed opportunities, and of a mystery that still refuses to surrender its final answer. So before we step into Cabin 28, before we examine the bloodstained evidence, the conflicting witness accounts, the suspicious behavior, and the unanswered questions, we must first understand the world that existed before fear arrived. Because only by knowing who the Sharp family were, how they lived, what they dreamed about, and why they came to that quiet mountain town, can we truly understand everything that was lost on the night of April 11, 1981. That is where our story truly begins. The story of the Keddie cabin murders does not begin with blood. It begins with a place. Long before investigators arrived carrying evidence bags and cameras, before newspaper reporters crowded the narrow mountain roads, and before the name Keddie became permanently attached to one of California's most haunting unsolved crimes. It was simply another small community tucked deep within the Sierra Nevada. If you had visited Keddie in the spring of 1981, you might have driven past it without realizing you had entered the town at all. The roads curved gently through dense forests where towering pine and cedar trees stretched toward the sky like ancient guardians. The Feather River carved its way through the canyon below, its cold water reflecting the changing colors of the mountains with every passing season. Railroad tracks cut through the valley, occasionally interrupted by long freight trains whose distant rumble echoed between the cliffs before fading back into silence. It was beautiful. Not the polished beauty of expensive vacation resorts or postcard destinations, but something quieter, more honest. The kind of beauty that belonged to forgotten places where life moved slowly enough for neighbors to know each other's names. The Keddie Resort had once attracted families escaping the summer heat of California cities. Small wooden cabins scattered across the hillside offered simple accommodations surrounded by forests and fresh mountain air. Children explored dirt paths between the cabins while adults gathered on porches during warm evenings, believing they had found a place where the outside world could not easily reach them. By 1981, however, Keddie had changed. The resort's busiest years were already behind it. Some cabins remained vacation homes, but many had become permanent residences for families who could not afford to live elsewhere. Seasonal workers, railroad employees, retirees, and people looking for inexpensive housing gradually transformed the resort into a small residential community. The paint on several cabins had begun to fade beneath years of harsh winters and dry summers. Wooden decks creaked under familiar footsteps. Pickup trucks coated in mountain dust rested beside weathered buildings that had seen better decades. Life was modest. Money was often tight. Yet for many residents, Keddie represented something valuable that larger towns could not offer: peace. Children still wandered freely from one cabin to another. It was common for friends to spend the night at a neighbor's house without much planning. Parents rarely imagined that danger could arrive from within such a familiar community. Doors were not always locked. People borrowed tools, shared meals, exchanged conversations across porches, and trusted the faces they saw almost every day. That trust became part of the town's identity. It also became one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Nestled among the cabins stood Cabin 28. It was neither the largest nor the smallest structure in the community. Like the others surrounding it, the cabin was built primarily from wood, its exterior blending naturally into the forest around it. A short set of steps led toward the entrance. Windows looked out over nearby cabins and the winding roads that connected the settlement together. Inside, the rooms were practical rather than spacious. Furniture filled the available space without much decoration. Every corner reflected the realities of raising a large family on a limited income. To an outsider, Cabin 28 appeared entirely ordinary. There was no reason to remember it. No reason to photograph it. No reason to believe it would soon become one of the most studied crime scenes in California history. For Sue Sharp, however, Cabin 28 represented something much more significant than a mailing address. It represented another chance. Following the breakdown of her marriage, she faced the enormous challenge of raising 6 children largely on her own. The responsibilities were relentless. Every decision carried consequences. Every dollar had to stretch further than seemed possible. Like countless single parents, she found herself balancing hope against hardship every single day. Moving to Keddie was not about chasing luxury. It was about building stability. The mountains offered distance from the past. The quiet community promised an environment where her children could grow up surrounded by nature instead of constant uncertainty. The cabin was affordable, large enough to accommodate everyone, and far removed from the conflicts that had defined earlier chapters of her life. Fresh starts often begin in places that seem unremarkable. Cabin 28 was one of those places. Inside its walls, daily life unfolded through familiar routines. School mornings were busy. Meals required planning. Laundry accumulated faster than it could be finished. The younger children filled the house with energy while the older ones gradually sought more independence, spending increasing amounts of time with friends throughout the community. It was a real home. Not perfect. Not effortless. But alive. Visitors remembered the atmosphere as informal and welcoming. Children came and went. Friends stopped by without elaborate invitations. Conversations drifted between rooms while everyday responsibilities quietly continued around them. Nothing suggested that the house was carrying the weight of a future tragedy. If anything, Cabin 28 reflected resilience. Each repaired piece of furniture, each shared meal around the table, each ordinary evening represented another small victory over the difficulties that Sue had worked so hard to overcome. The surrounding community mirrored that sense of quiet endurance. Residents understood that mountain life required cooperation. Harsh winters, isolated roads, and limited resources encouraged neighbors to rely upon one another. People noticed unfamiliar vehicles. They recognized footsteps on gravel paths. They remembered who visited whom and roughly when. At least, they believed they did. Only later would investigators discover how unreliable memory can become once fear enters the picture. Because memory changes. Conversations become uncertain. Timelines begin shifting. Ordinary observations suddenly carry enormous importance. A truck parked outside a cabin. A conversation remembered only in fragments. Someone walking through the trees after dark. Details that once meant nothing become evidence everyone wishes they had noticed more carefully. But in early April of 1981, no one was documenting ordinary life. No one imagined that nearly every movement inside this small community would eventually be reconstructed by detectives searching desperately for the truth. Spring had only recently begun reclaiming the mountains from winter. Snow still lingered across higher elevations while the valleys slowly welcomed longer daylight and milder temperatures. The forests appeared vibrant after months of cold weather. The scent of damp earth mixed with pine resin drifted through the air. Birds returned to familiar branches. The changing season carried the quiet optimism that accompanies renewal. For the Sharp family, renewal was exactly what they hoped to find. They could not know that the same mountains offering comfort would soon become the backdrop for one of the state's most enduring mysteries. Every tragedy has a setting. Some unfold in crowded cities filled with strangers. Others occur in isolated homes where help lies miles away. The Keddy murders belonged to neither extreme. They occurred in a place where neighbors lived close enough to recognize one another, yet far enough apart that darkness could hide terrible secrets between the trees. That contrast would haunt investigators for decades. How could such extraordinary violence occur within a community that seemed so peaceful? How could a place defined by familiarity become the scene of unimaginable brutality? The answers, if they existed at all, were still hidden somewhere in the quiet rhythms of daily life. And before that silence was shattered forever, there was still one family trying to believe that they had finally found a place to call home. O fan tip theo, 2b, Kor chuyen se chuyen sang chan dung kai tiat kwa su sharp va kwok song thwong hat kwa jia din truak dem din men, jayu nip kucham va jayao hinon. For Su Sharp, life had never followed a straight line. Every chapter seemed to demand a new beginning before the previous one had fully settled. The collapse of her marriage had forced her to redefine what home meant, not only for herself but for 6 children who looked to her for reassurance every single day. There was no instruction manual for carrying that weight. Every morning began with responsibilities that could not be postponed, and every evening ended with quiet calculations about what still needed to be done tomorrow. To the outside world, she was simply another single mother living in a modest cabin in the mountains. To her children, she was the center around which everything else revolved. Cabin 28 was rarely silent. There was always someone getting ready for school, someone searching for a misplaced jacket, someone arguing over whose turn it was to wash dishes, or someone laughing at a joke that would be forgotten by the next afternoon. Like any household with 6 children, life unfolded in controlled chaos. The walls were thin enough for conversations to drift from one room to another, and privacy was often a luxury rather than an expectation. Yet within that constant movement existed something far more valuable than comfort. There was familiarity. Each child had carved out a place within the rhythms of the household. They knew which floorboards creaked beneath certain footsteps. They knew where the afternoon sunlight reached the living room floor. They knew the smell of dinner before anyone called them to the table. Home was not defined by expensive furniture or perfect order. It was defined by repetition, by routines so ordinary that no one ever imagined they could disappear overnight. Sue worked tirelessly to preserve those routines. Friends and neighbors remembered her as a woman who appeared determined to keep moving forward regardless of the obstacles in front of her. Raising 6 children alone demanded resilience that often went unnoticed. Bills still arrived whether money was available or not. Clothes had to be washed. Meals had to be prepared. School events continued. Illnesses came without warning. Through it all, she kept the family together with quiet persistence rather than dramatic gestures. She was building something fragile. Not perfection. Stability. The children, like children everywhere, occupied different stages of growing up. The older ones were beginning to explore independence. Friendships became increasingly important. Weekends often meant spending time with other teenagers scattered throughout the Keddie community. Small adventures filled their days, walking the dirt roads, visiting neighboring cabins, talking for hours about dreams that seemed limitless because adulthood still felt impossibly distant. The younger children lived in a different world altogether. To them, the forest surrounding Keddie was less mysterious than magical. Towering pines became castles. Dirt paths transformed into secret trails. Every afternoon offered another opportunity for imagination to reshape the familiar landscape. They chased one another between cabins, collected interesting rocks, climbed fallen logs, and returned home with muddy shoes that quietly testified to another day well spent. That freedom reflected the trust shared throughout the community. Parents rarely worried when children disappeared for a few hours to play nearby. Everyone knew everyone, or at least believed they did. Familiar faces became a substitute for constant supervision. It was an understanding built over years rather than spoken aloud. In retrospect, that trust seems almost unimaginable. Today, many parents would hesitate to allow children such independence. Yet in 1981, particularly within a small mountain community like Keddie, life moved according to different expectations. The world felt smaller. Neighbors looked after one another almost without thinking. A child walking from one cabin to another attracted little attention because it happened every day. Ordinary moments rarely announce their importance while they are happening. A shared dinner. A casual conversation. A sibling teasing another across the living room. A mother reminding someone not to stay out too late. These moments become precious only after they are gone. No one inside cabin 28 understood that they were living through their final ordinary weekend together. Saturday, April 11, 1981, unfolded much like countless Saturdays before it. The mountains wore the gentle colors of early spring. Cool morning air gradually gave way to a mild afternoon as sunlight filtered through the forest canopy. The sounds of everyday life echoed softly across the community. Doors opened and closed. Vehicles traveled slowly along the narrow roads. Neighbors greeted one another without realizing they were participating in what would later become the final memories of a peaceful Keddie. Inside the Sharp household, plans developed naturally rather than formally. The older children arranged to spend time with friends. The younger ones looked forward to another evening in the familiar comfort of home. Nothing demanded urgency. Nothing suggested that careful attention should be paid to seemingly insignificant decisions. Yet history often turns on decisions that appear completely ordinary at the time. One child deciding to stay with friends. Another inviting someone over. Someone choosing to remain home instead of going out. Taken individually, these choices meant nothing. Together, they would determine who was present inside cabin 28 when darkness settled over the mountains. As afternoon slowly surrendered to evening, lights began appearing inside neighboring cabins one by one. Curtains glowed warmly against the deepening blue sky. The forest gradually transformed as daylight retreated, replacing familiar landmarks with long shadows stretching between the trees. The temperature dropped, encouraging families indoors where conversations continued over evening meals and television programs. The Sharp family followed those same familiar rhythms. There was no dramatic argument. No obvious warning. No indication that danger had already begun moving toward them. Elsewhere within the community, people prepared for another quiet night. Some visited neighbors before returning home. Others settled into comfortable routines that had changed little over the years. The isolation that once made Keddie feel peaceful now wrapped itself around the cabins with almost complete stillness. When darkness fully arrived, the town seemed to disappear into the surrounding forest. Only scattered porch lights interrupted the blackness between the trees. It was the kind of night that encouraged people to believe they were safely hidden from the outside world. But isolation can offer comfort to more than one kind of visitor. Somewhere beyond the warm lights shining through Cabin 28's windows, events were quietly aligning. Someone was making decisions. Someone was moving through the same roads, the same forest, the same darkness that every resident considered familiar. Whether those movements were planned long in advance or unfolded unexpectedly remains one of the central mysteries of this case. What is certain is that the final peaceful evening inside Cabin 28 had already begun. The family did not know they were living through their last ordinary hours together. They laughed. They talked. They made plans for tomorrow. Tomorrow, they believed, would arrive exactly as it always had. It never did. As night settled completely over Keddy, the mountains grew silent once more. The cabins stood quietly beneath towering pines, their windows glowing like small islands of warmth against the darkness. To anyone looking from a distance, nothing appeared unusual. But sometimes the most devastating stories begin precisely when everything still looks perfectly ordinary. And before midnight arrived, the quiet world surrounding Cabin 28 was already moving toward a moment from which it would never recover. As evening settled over Keddy on April 11, 1981, the mountain air turned noticeably colder. The last traces of sunlight slipped behind the ridges, leaving the narrow valley wrapped in deep blue shadows. One by one, porch lights flickered to life across the small community, their warm glow barely reaching beyond the edges of wooden decks before being swallowed by the surrounding forest. Night arrived differently in Keddy than it did in the cities. There were no endless rows of streetlights pushing back the darkness. No constant traffic humming in the distance. No neon signs reflecting from rain-soaked pavement. Instead, darkness belonged to the mountains. Once the sun disappeared, the forest reclaimed everything beyond the small circles of light spilling from cabin windows. For the people who lived there, that darkness was familiar. It was part of home. Children had grown up falling asleep to the distant sound of freight trains winding through Feather River Canyon. They recognized the wind as it passed through the towering pines and understood that every creak of an old wooden cabin had a perfectly ordinary explanation. The silence never felt threatening because it had always been there. That familiarity created a quiet confidence. People believed they knew this place. They believed they understood the people who shared it. Most of all, they believed danger belonged somewhere else. Inside Cabin 28, the family continued through the ordinary rhythm of a Saturday night. Nothing in those final hours appeared significant enough to be remembered. No one consciously memorized the sound of footsteps moving through the hallway or the sight of evening light fading from the living room windows. Those moments carried no weight because everyone expected thousands more just like them. Perhaps that is one of the cruelest truths about tragedy. We never recognize the last ordinary moment while we are living it. We only discover it afterward. As the hours passed, each member of the Sharp family naturally drifted toward separate plans. Sheila, the oldest daughter present that evening, arranged to spend the night with friends in another cabin nearby. Sleepovers were common within the close-knit community. It was the sort of decision that required little discussion because everyone involved was familiar with one another. For a 14-year-old girl growing up in Keddy, it felt like any other weekend. She could not have imagined that saying goodbye to her family that evening would become the final time she would ever see most of them alive. John Sharp, 15 years old, spent time with his close friend Dana Wingate. Dana was 17, older, confident, and well known among local teenagers. Like countless teenage friendships, theirs required little planning. Spending the evening together felt natural. Eventually, Dana accompanied John back to Cabin 28, where he would remain for the night. Neither teenager could possibly know they were walking toward history. Rick and Greg, the younger brothers, prepared to spend another night in the room they shared with family friend Justin Smott. Their concerns were the ordinary concerns of childhood. Tomorrow still existed in their minds. Morning would come. Breakfast would follow. Life would continue exactly as it always had. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was also home that evening. At 12, life exists in a unique space between childhood and adolescence. Old enough to crave independence but still young enough to rely deeply on family, Tina occupied that uncertain middle ground. Like her brothers and sisters, she had gradually adapted to life in Keddie after the family's move. The mountains had become familiar. The cabin had become home. No one knew that before dawn, she would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the entire case. Outside, the community slowly settled into sleep. Television sets switched off. Doors were locked. Lights disappeared behind curtains. The roads emptied until only occasional sounds disturbed the stillness. Somewhere far below, another freight train traced its familiar route through the canyon, its whistle echoing softly against the mountains before fading into the distance. Everything appeared peaceful. That appearance would later trouble investigators almost as much as the crime itself. Because peace can be deceptive. The Keddie resort was not isolated from civilization, yet it possessed enough distance from larger towns that emergencies could unfold without immediate attention. The cabins were close enough for neighbors to know one another, but far enough apart that darkness and dense trees concealed much of what happened after sunset. It was a setting that offered comfort to families. It also offered opportunity to anyone wishing to move unseen. Exactly what happened after midnight remains one of the greatest unanswered questions in American criminal history. Investigators would spend decades attempting to reconstruct those missing hours. They would compare witness statements, analyze physical evidence, revisit timelines, and test countless theories. Some believed the attack had been carefully planned. Others argued that events spiraled unexpectedly after a confrontation inside the cabin. No definitive answer has ever emerged. What is known comes only from the evidence left behind. The people who could tell the complete story never had the chance. As the night deepened, Cabin 28 disappeared into the darkness like every other home in Keddie. From outside, nothing distinguished it from the neighboring cabins scattered across the hillside. A passerby would have noticed only another quiet residence where a family had gone to bed after an ordinary Saturday. The mountains remained silent. The forest remained still. Time moved forward with complete indifference. Somewhere during those unseen hours, however, the future changed forever. The decisions made inside or outside that cabin would echo across generations. Detectives not yet assigned to the case would eventually spend years searching for answers hidden within those hours. Journalists would fill thousands of pages trying to reconstruct them. Families would spend decades waiting for certainty that might never arrive. Yet at that moment, none of those futures existed. There was only darkness. Only a modest wooden cabin nestled among towering pines. Only a mother who believed her children were safe beneath the same roof. Only children expecting another sunrise. History often presents tragedy as though it arrives with unmistakable warning signs. In reality, it usually arrives in silence. It waits patiently until routine has convinced everyone that tomorrow is guaranteed. Then, without asking permission, it divides life into two parts, everything that happened before, and everything that followed after. For the residents of Keddie, April 11, 1981, would become that dividing line. From the next morning onward, neighbors would no longer remember the town simply as a peaceful mountain community. They would remember police cars parked beneath the pines. They would remember investigators walking between cabins with solemn expressions. They would remember reporters arriving from outside counties, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Most of all, they would remember Cabin 28. Not as a home. Not as the place where a family once tried to build a new beginning. But as the center of a mystery that would survive long after the cabin itself disappeared. Because although buildings can be demolished, forests can regrow, and decades can pass, some nights refuse to remain in the past. The night of April 11, 1981, is one of them. And before we examine the violence that shattered the silence of Cabin 28, we must first know the people whose lives gave that house its warmth, its laughter, and its meaning. Only then can we understand the true cost of what was taken away. The next chapter is not about the crime. It is about the family. Before they became victims. Before their names appeared in headlines. Before the world came to know the words the Keddie Cabin murders. Every true crime story faces the same temptation. To begin with the crime. To let violence define the people whose lives were stolen. To remember victims only through crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and newspaper headlines. But if we do that, we lose something essential. We lose the people behind the case. Because before they became victims, they were simply a family. They were not living inside a mystery. They were living their lives. The Sharp family never asked to become part of American criminal history. They never imagined that strangers, decades later, would study faded photographs of their home, memorize the layout of Cabin 28, or debate theories about what happened during their final hours together. Their story was never meant to be remembered this way. It was supposed to be ordinary. At the center of that ordinary life stood Sue Sharp. At 36 years old, Sue carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who had learned that life rarely became easier simply because it was unfair. She had endured the breakdown of her marriage and accepted the enormous responsibility of raising 6 children largely on her own. It was not the life she had once imagined, but it was the life she had, and she met it with the kind of resilience that often goes unnoticed because it unfolds behind closed doors. No audience applauds a mother who wakes before everyone else to prepare breakfast. No headlines celebrate the countless small sacrifices that hold a struggling family together. Yet those unseen moments often reveal more about a person's character than any dramatic event ever could. Every day demanded decisions. How to stretch limited money just a little further. Which bills could wait another week. How to make sure every child felt loved, even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm every waking hour. Like many single parents, Sue became an expert at solving problems no one else ever saw. To her children, she was more than the person who enforced rules or prepared meals. She was stability. She was the familiar voice calling everyone to dinner. The reassuring presence still awake after nightmares. The person who somehow made difficult days feel survivable simply by continuing to move forward. Friends who knew Sue described a woman trying to build a better future rather than dwelling on the disappointments of the past. Moving to Keddie had not erased life's hardships, but it had offered something equally valuable: distance. Distance from painful memories. Distance from conflict. Distance that allowed her children to grow within a quieter environment surrounded by forests instead of constant uncertainty. She understood that fresh starts rarely happen all at once. They are built slowly. One ordinary day at a time. Inside Cabin 28, those ordinary days accumulated into a life that, while imperfect, possessed its own quiet rhythm. Shoes gathered near the doorway. Schoolbooks found temporary homes on kitchen tables. Laundry baskets seemed to refill almost as quickly as they were emptied. The sounds of siblings moving between rooms blended into the familiar soundtrack of a busy household. No one considered these details remarkable. Families rarely do. Yet after tragedy, those smallest memories often become the ones survivors treasure most. The sound of laughter drifting down a hallway. The smell of breakfast on a Sunday morning. The sight of children arguing over something they would forget before lunchtime. Ordinary moments become priceless because they can never happen again. Sue's oldest children were beginning to stand at the edge of adulthood. John Sharp, 15 years old, was reaching the age where childhood gradually gave way to independence. Like many teenagers, his world increasingly revolved around friendships, conversations that stretched late into the evening, and dreams that extended well beyond the small mountain community where he lived. Those who knew John remembered a teenager who enjoyed spending time with friends and exploring the freedom that came with growing older. Keddie, despite its small size, offered enough independence for teenagers to feel as though the entire community belonged to them. Dirt roads became gathering places. Neighboring cabins became familiar destinations. Time seemed less structured than it would in larger towns. John embraced that freedom. At 15, tomorrow appeared limitless. High school would eventually end. Adult life remained comfortably distant. The future still belonged to imagination rather than responsibility. His younger sister, Tina Sharp, occupied a very different stage of life. At 12 years old, she stood between childhood and adolescence, old enough to notice the world changing around her yet young enough to retain the quiet optimism unique to that age. She shared the same home, the same routines, and the same mountain landscape that surrounded her brothers and sisters. Like every child, Tina carried a future invisible to everyone around her. Birthdays not yet celebrated. Friendships not yet formed. Dreams not yet spoken aloud. No one looking at her could have imagined how central her disappearance would become to the mystery that followed. Her name would eventually appear in countless newspaper articles, documentaries, and investigative reports. But before any of that, she was simply Sue's daughter. A sister. A child growing up in a small mountain community where the future still seemed wide open. The younger boys, Rick and Greg, experienced Keddy through the uncomplicated lens of childhood. Forest trails promised adventure. Fallen trees became pirate ships or forts. Every afternoon held the possibility of discovering something new, even if that discovery was nothing more than an unusual rock or an interesting insect hidden beneath a log. Children possess a remarkable ability to transform ordinary places into extraordinary worlds. For Rick and Greg, Cabin 28 was not defined by financial hardship or adult concerns. It was home. A place where bedtime stories ended with tomorrow's adventures already waiting. A place where siblings argued, laughed, made up, and repeated the cycle all over again. Those memories mattered far more than the condition of the furniture or the size of the rooms. Then there was Sheila. At 14, she stood between the responsibilities of adulthood and the freedoms of youth. Old enough to help care for younger siblings, yet still discovering who she wanted to become, Sheila represented the quiet transition every family eventually witnesses as children begin growing into young adults. She could never have known that one ordinary decision, to spend the night away from Cabin 28, would forever divide her life into two separate chapters. One in which her family still existed. And one in which almost everything familiar had vanished before sunrise. Looking back now, it is easy to see the Sharp family only through the lens of tragedy. But doing so misses the truth. Their lives were not defined by the violence that ended them. They were defined by countless ordinary moments that came before. Shared meals. Family conversations. Homework spread across kitchen tables. Children laughing somewhere beyond the cabin walls while the mountain wind moved gently through the trees. That ordinary life is worth remembering. Because when tragedy finally arrived, it did not destroy strangers whose names happened to appear in a police report. It destroyed a family that had spent years trying to rebuild a future together. And like every family, they believed there would always be another morning. If you were to step inside Cabin 28 in the days before April 11, 1981, you would not have found a family consumed by fear. You would have found the beautiful disorder that exists in almost every home with children. The living room was a place where conversations overlapped, where someone was always looking for something that had been misplaced only moments before, and where silence rarely lasted for very long. Each member of the Sharp family carried a different personality, a different rhythm, a different way of moving through the world. Together, those differences formed the quiet balance of a home that had learned to adapt. John Sharp was 15 years old, an age where life often feels as though it is beginning to unfold at incredible speed. Childhood was slowly slipping away, replaced by the excitement of growing independence. Friends became increasingly important. Conversations with adults grew shorter while evenings spent with people his own age seemed to stretch endlessly. Like many boys his age, John was beginning to imagine the person he might someday become. The future still felt enormous. There were schools to finish, places to visit, experiences waiting somewhere beyond the mountains that surrounded Keddy. Responsibilities belonged to adults. For now, life revolved around friendships, laughter, and the simple confidence that tomorrow would always arrive. One of those friendships was with 17-year-old Dana Wingate. Dana was not a member of the Sharp family, yet in many ways he reflected the same ordinary hopes shared by countless teenagers. Friends often become temporary extensions of a family. They share meals, spend nights at each other's homes, and gradually become familiar faces welcomed through the front door without ceremony. Dana was one of those friends. On the evening of April 11th, accompanying John back to cabin 28 likely felt no more significant than dozens of similar evenings before it. It was a casual decision born from ordinary teenage routine. Neither of them could have known they were stepping into the final night of their lives. Then there was Tina. Of all the names connected to the Keddy case, hers remains perhaps the most haunting. Not because investigators know the least about her, but because her story never truly ended inside cabin 28. At 12 years old, Tina existed in that fleeting season between childhood innocence and adolescence. She was old enough to understand that the world could sometimes be difficult, yet young enough to believe that home remained the safest place anyone could be. There are photographs of Tina smiling, her expression carrying the openness so common among children who have not yet learned how quickly life can change. Looking at those photographs today is unsettling, not because they reveal hidden sadness, but because they reveal the opposite. They show normalcy. A child with years still waiting ahead. A girl whose future should have included graduations, friendships, first jobs, holidays, and eventually stories of her own to tell. Instead, history remembers her for a disappearance that continues to trouble investigators decades later. It is one of the greatest tragedies of unsolved crime that a person's final chapter often overshadows every chapter that came before. Yet before she became the missing child at the center of a national mystery, Tina was simply a daughter and a sister. She shared meals with her family. She laughed with her brothers. She lived inside the same routines that define ordinary childhood everywhere. Rick and Greg experienced those routines differently. Being younger, their world remained centered around imagination rather than responsibility. The forests surrounding Keddy became endless playgrounds where every fallen tree suggested a new adventure. They explored without constantly measuring risk because childhood rarely does. Every day carried the promise of discovering something unexpected. Children have an extraordinary relationship with time. Tomorrow always feels guaranteed. Summer seems endless. Adults worry about things that appear impossibly distant. Rick and Greg viewed cabin 28 through exactly that lens. It was not a place marked by hardship. It was where they slept, played, argued with siblings, and returned after long afternoons outside. Home required no further definition. Sheila, meanwhile, stood at a unique point within the family. At 14, she was beginning to understand responsibilities that younger children rarely notice. She helped around the house. She watched her younger brothers and sisters. At the same time, she remained a teenager eager to spend time with friends and experience the growing independence that came with age. Her decision to stay overnight with neighbors on April 11th was entirely ordinary. In another timeline, it would never have mattered. It would have been remembered only as another pleasant weekend spent with friends before returning home the following morning. History transformed that ordinary decision into something unimaginable. Because when dawn arrived, Sheila became the only one of Sue's older children to survive the night simply because she had slept somewhere else. Survival sometimes depends upon choices so small they appear meaningless until viewed through the lens of tragedy. A different invitation. A different bedtime. A different place to spend one ordinary evening. Looking back, people naturally search for signs that might have warned the family. Perhaps there was an unusual conversation. Perhaps someone noticed unfamiliar behavior. Perhaps danger announced itself in ways no one recognized. The truth is almost certainly more unsettling. There may have been no warning at all. Life often continues with remarkable normality right up until the moment everything changes. That reality is difficult to accept because it reminds us how fragile ordinary life truly is. The Sharp family did not spend April 11th preparing for disaster. They prepared for another Sunday. School would soon begin again. Chores still needed to be completed. Plans existed beyond the weekend. Every member of the household behaved as though the future remained comfortably predictable. That assumption connected them to millions of families across the country who ended their Saturday evenings in exactly the same way. Dinner was eaten. Conversations faded. Lights gradually turned off as one family member after another prepared for bed. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing demanded alarm. Nothing suggested that history was quietly approaching through the darkness outside. Years later, investigators, journalists, and researchers would spend countless hours attempting to reconstruct those final ordinary moments. They examined timelines with extraordinary precision. They compared statements from witnesses who could recall only fragments. They attempted to identify exactly when each person had last been seen alive. Yet no investigation, no matter how thorough, can fully recreate the countless tiny interactions that make up family life. The joke shared between siblings. The goodnight spoken in passing. The casual promise to see someone in the morning. Those moments disappeared with the people who experienced them. Perhaps that is why the Sharp family continues to resonate so deeply with those who study this case. They were not extraordinary because of fame, wealth, or public attention. They were extraordinary because they were ordinary. Their story could have belonged to countless families searching for stability after hardship. A mother determined to provide a better future. Children learning, growing, arguing, laughing, and imagining lives that stretched far beyond the small mountain town they called home. For a brief moment in time, Cabin 28 contained all of those hopes beneath one roof. Then the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness settled over Keddy. One daughter spent the night with friends. One teenage boy welcomed a friend into his home. 3 younger children prepared for bed, believing tomorrow would arrive like every other day before it. And somewhere beyond the warm light shining through the cabin windows, unseen by everyone inside, the first steps toward one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries were already being taken. The most difficult part of studying a tragedy is understanding how normal everything felt before it happened. When people look back at the final hours of the Sharp family, there is a natural desire to search for something unusual. A warning sign. A moment when someone should have realized that danger was approaching. A conversation that carried hidden meaning. But life rarely works that way. The evening of April 11, 1981, did not feel like the final night of anything. It felt like a beginning. A beginning of another week. Another school schedule. Another series of ordinary responsibilities that would fill the days ahead. Inside Cabin 28, the Sharp family existed in that familiar space between routine and uncertainty. They had experienced difficult times before, but they had also built something meaningful together. Their lives were not defined by what they lacked. They were defined by the small moments they created despite those challenges. That was the world that existed before the crime. A world of ordinary conversations and familiar faces. A world where children still believed adults could solve problems. A world where a mother could look around her home and believe that, despite everything, her family was together. Sue Sharp understood hardship. She understood disappointment. She understood that life sometimes forced people to rebuild when they would rather remain comfortable. But she also understood something equally important. A family did not need a perfect house to be a home. It needed people who cared about one another. And that was what Cabin 28 represented. It was not a symbol of success. It was not a place anyone would have described as luxurious. It was a shelter. A place where 6 children had grown older. A place where birthdays had been celebrated. A place where arguments had ended in forgiveness. A place where countless moments had passed without anyone realizing they would someday become memories. For Sue, the responsibility of motherhood was constant. Even ordinary evenings required attention. Was everyone where they were supposed to be? Had everyone eaten? Did younger children have everything ready for the next day? Were older children making responsible choices? These questions were part of the invisible work she carried every day. Most people never see the full weight carried by parents. They see the results. A meal prepared. A child dressed for school. A household continuing to function. They rarely see the exhaustion, the worries, or the private moments when someone wonders whether they are doing enough. Sue's life was built around doing enough. Every day, she tried. And in the final evening of her life, there was no reason to believe tomorrow would be different. Her children were growing. The family had survived previous struggles. The future remained open. John was becoming more independent. Sheila was developing her own friendships and identity. Tina was moving through the complicated years between childhood and adolescence. Rick and Greg were still young enough to find adventure in ordinary places. Each child represented a different stage of life. Each carried possibilities that would never be fulfilled. That is what makes the story of the Sharp family so painful. The tragedy did not only take away people. It took away futures. There are countless invisible moments that vanished with them. The conversations that would never happen. The advice Sue would never give. The birthdays that would never be celebrated. The memories that would never be created. For the surviving members of the family, grief was not only about losing the people they loved. It was also about losing the future they imagined with them. That future disappeared during one night in a quiet mountain community. But before that happened, there was still a family. There was still warmth inside Cabin 28. There was still the possibility that the next morning would bring nothing more than another ordinary Sunday. The younger children eventually settled into the room where they would sleep alongside family friend Justin Smott. At their age, nighttime was rarely filled with complicated thoughts. Sleep arrived easily after another day of ordinary experiences. Tomorrow seemed certain. Morning was not something they questioned. It was simply something that happened. For John and Dana, the evening represented typical teenage life. Spending time together, talking, and staying over at a friend's home were not unusual choices. No one viewed the arrangement as risky. No one had a reason to believe anything could go wrong. For Sheila, the decision to spend the night away from home seemed equally ordinary. She was 14. She wanted to spend time with friends. She followed a normal teenage impulse. A single choice that seemed completely insignificant would later become the reason she survived. That fact has remained one of the most haunting elements of the case. In many tragedies, survivors can identify the exact moment they escaped danger. In this case, survival was determined by something far simpler. She was somewhere else. That was all. No one could have known the significance of that decision. No one could have predicted that the next time Sheila entered Cabin 28, she would not be returning home. She would be entering a crime scene. She would be stepping into a nightmare. As the evening moved deeper into night, Keddie became quiet. The small community settled beneath the darkness of the Sierra Nevada. The trees stood motionless against the sky. The roads emptied. Cabins closed themselves away from the outside world. The residents of Keddie trusted the silence around them because silence had always meant safety. They had no reason to think otherwise. That trust was part of what made the crime so devastating. The attack did not happen in a place known for danger. It happened in a place people believed protected them from danger. The mountains had always represented distance from chaos. The cabin had represented security. The community had represented familiarity. All three would be forever changed. The last hours before the murders remain filled with unanswered questions. Who was watching Cabin 28? Who knew who was inside? Was the attack planned? Was someone already familiar with the family? Did the killer or killers understand the layout of the home? Did they know that children were sleeping nearby? Every investigation begins with these questions. But before investigators could ask them, the night had already passed. The answers were hidden in the darkness. The people who knew the truth were gone. And the survivors who remained were left with memories they would spend their entire lives trying to understand. When morning arrived on April 12, 1981, Keddie would wake up to a reality no one could have imagined. A peaceful mountain community would become the center of one of America's most disturbing mysteries. A small wooden cabin would become a symbol of unanswered questions. And the Sharp family, who had once been known only by their neighbors, would become remembered across the country. Not because of how they died, but because of who they were before that night. A mother trying to protect her children. Children growing up and discovering the world around them. A family searching for stability in a quiet corner of California. They deserved more than to become a mystery. They deserved to be remembered as people. And that is why, before entering the darkness of Cabin 28, we must carry their lives with us. Because the story that follows is not simply about a crime. It is about the moment an ordinary family was taken from the world. And about the decades spent searching for the truth of what happened after the lights went out. The night of April 11, 1981, began like any other night in Keddie. That is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. There was no dramatic warning. No moment when the world seemed to pause and announce that something terrible was approaching. No sound that made neighbors step outside and wonder if something was wrong. The mountains remained quiet. The cabins remained still. Life continued as it always had. Inside Cabin 28, a family was preparing for sleep while the darkness of the Sierra Nevada slowly surrounded them. The small wooden structure that had sheltered the Sharp family for nearly 2 years appeared no different from any other evening. The same walls that had absorbed years of conversations and laughter now stood silently around the people who would soon become the center of one of America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. The evening unfolded through ordinary choices. The kind of choices people make thousands of times without ever considering their consequences. A teenager deciding where to spend the night. A friend choosing to stay over. A younger child preparing for bed. A mother trusting that her children were safe under the same roof. Those choices would later become the foundation of an investigation. But at the time, they were simply life. 14-year-old Sheila Sharp was not at home that night. She had chosen to stay with friends nearby, a decision that seemed completely normal within the close community of Keddie. Teenagers moved between cabins regularly. Parents knew the families involved. There was a level of trust that made such arrangements feel harmless. No one questioned it. No one needed to. For Sheila, the night likely carried the same excitement and comfort as countless sleepovers before it. There was no reason to believe she was separating herself from a tragedy. There was no reason to believe that by morning, her entire understanding of family would be shattered. Back at Cabin 28, 15-year-old John Sharp remained home with his friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. The two teenagers were familiar with one another's company. Their friendship existed within the ordinary world of young people who spend evenings together because being around friends feels more natural than being alone. At 17, Dana was standing close to adulthood. At 15, John was beginning to explore independence. Both were at an age where the future seemed almost endless. The choices ahead of them appeared limitless. Neither boy knew that the night would become the final page of their story. In another house, on another night, their decision to stay together would have meant nothing. It would have been forgotten almost immediately. But tragedy has a way of transforming ordinary moments into permanent memories. While the older children followed their own plans, the younger children prepared for sleep. Rick Sharp, 10 years old, and Greg Sharp, 5 years old, remained inside the cabin with their friend Justin Smott. The three boys settled into the room where they would spend the night, unaware that only a short distance away, events were moving toward something unimaginable. This detail would later become one of the most troubling mysteries of the entire case. 3 children slept inside the same home where 3 people would be killed. The physical distance between them was small. The emotional distance between their experience and what happened nearby was impossible to understand. Did they truly sleep through everything? Did the walls of the cabin conceal sounds that might have revealed the danger? Did fear prevent memories from forming clearly? These questions would follow investigators for years. And while the younger children slept, 12-year-old Tina Sharp remained inside Cabin 28. Like every other member of the family, she had no reason to believe that the night would be different from any other. That tomorrow would not arrive as expected. That the room she knew as home would become the final place where she was seen alive. The hours passed slowly. The mountain air grew colder. The darkness outside became deeper. Across Keddie, families closed their doors and settled into the quiet routines of nighttime. Some residents watched television. Others prepared for sleep. The community gradually disappeared into silence, protected by the belief that danger belonged somewhere beyond the boundaries of their small mountain world. Inside Cabin 28, The final moments of normal life were unfolding. Perhaps there was conversation. Perhaps there was laughter. Perhaps there were simple goodnight exchanges that no one realized would become important forever. These are the moments investigators can never recover. They can examine evidence. They can analyze physical details. They can build timelines. But they cannot recreate the final ordinary interactions between people who never knew they were experiencing them for the last time. Eventually, night settled completely over Keddie. The surrounding forest became a wall of darkness. The roads became empty. The cabin windows became small rectangles of warm light surrounded by endless trees. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. That was the nature of the tragedy. The most terrifying moments of the night did not announce themselves. They unfolded quietly. Somewhere during the early morning hours of April 12th, the peaceful image of Cabin 28 was destroyed. The exact sequence remains one of the central mysteries of the case. Investigators have spent decades attempting to determine when the attack began, how long it lasted, and who was responsible. But the first hours after the crime created more uncertainty than clarity. Because by the time the world learned what had happened inside Cabin 28, the people who could explain it were already gone. What remained was a scene of violence, unanswered questions, and one missing child. The tragedy that began in the darkness would not be discovered until morning. And when it was finally discovered, the quiet mountain community of Keddie would never be the same again. Morning arrived in Keddie with the same quiet routine that had existed there for generations. The mountains did not know what had happened during the night. The trees did not change. The river continued moving through the canyon below. The first light of day slowly spread across the landscape, touching rooftops, dirt roads, and the wooden cabins scattered among the forest. To anyone looking from a distance, April 12, 1981, appeared to be an ordinary Sunday morning. But inside Cabin 28, nothing was ordinary anymore. The silence inside the house was not the peaceful silence of a family still sleeping. It was the silence left behind after something terrible had already happened. And no one outside the cabin knew it yet. 14-year-old Sheila Sharp was the first person to encounter the nightmare waiting inside. She had spent the previous night away from home, following a decision that seemed completely normal at the time. Like any teenager, she had no reason to expect that returning home the next morning would feel different from every other morning before it. She walked back toward Cabin 28 expecting to find her family. Perhaps she expected the familiar sounds of morning. Her mother's voice. Her siblings moving around. The ordinary signs of another day beginning. Instead, she opened the door to a scene that would permanently divide her life into two moments. Before and after. The details of what Sheila saw have remained one of the most haunting elements of the case. Inside the cabin, she found her mother, Sue Sharp, along with her brother John and John's friend Dana Wingate. They were not asleep. They were not injured in a way that suggested an accident. They were victims of a violent attack that had taken place while the rest of the community remained unaware. For Sheila, this was not a crime scene. Not at first. It was her home. A place filled with memories. A place where she had spent years growing up. A place where she expected safety. Now, that same place had become something she could barely recognize. The human mind struggles to process sudden trauma, especially when it destroys the very environment associated with comfort. The walls, the furniture, the familiar objects around the room all remained physically unchanged, yet their meaning had been completely transformed. Home had become a place of fear. The morning that should have brought routine instead brought unimaginable loss. And then came another realization. Tina was missing. At first, the absence of a person can feel almost impossible to comprehend. Maybe she was somewhere else. Maybe she had left. Maybe there was an explanation that had not yet been discovered. But as the hours passed, the reality became more frightening. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was gone. There was no clear explanation. No immediate answer. No certainty about whether she was alive. The disappearance of Tina changed the nature of the investigation before it even truly began. This was no longer only a murder case. It was also a search for a missing child. Every minute mattered. Every possibility had to be considered. Was Tina taken from the cabin? Did she leave willingly? Was she a witness to something that happened inside the home? Or had she become another victim? The uncertainty surrounding Tina's disappearance would become one of the most painful aspects of the case. 4 years, her family and investigators would be forced to live with the unknown. The other children inside the cabin created another mystery. Rick, Greg, and Justin had survived. They had been sleeping in another room. They were physically unharmed. The contrast was almost impossible to understand. A violent crime had occurred only a short distance away, yet these children remained alive. To investigators, this raised immediate questions. Had the attacker or attackers known they were there? Were they intentionally spared? Did the victims in the other room become targets for a specific reason? Or did circumstances simply unfold in a way no one could explain? The answers were hidden somewhere between evidence and memory, and both would prove difficult to recover. As word spread through the community, Keddy began waking up to a reality no one had imagined. Neighbors who had known the Sharp family were suddenly forced to confront the fact that violence had entered their quiet mountain community. People who had shared conversations with Sue. People who had watched the children grow up. People who had passed cabin 28 countless times without a second thought. Now stood outside wondering how such a thing could happen there. That question would echo for decades. How could a place that felt so safe become the scene of such brutality? The first responders and investigators arriving at cabin 28 faced a scene unlike anything many had encountered before. The violence inside the cabin immediately suggested that the attack was not random. The condition of the victims, the signs of struggle, and the missing child created a situation filled with urgency and confusion. But before investigators could begin answering questions, they had to understand the most basic one. What exactly had happened inside those walls? The first hours of any investigation are often the most important. Memories are fresh. Evidence is strongest. Details that seem insignificant may later become critical. But in Keddy, those early hours would become one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. The crime scene was not preserved in the way modern investigators would expect. People entered the area before it had been fully secured. Potential evidence was exposed to contamination. Important details may have been lost before professionals had the opportunity to document them properly. The consequences of those early decisions would follow the investigation for years. At the time, however, the focus remained on the immediate horror. 3 people were dead. 1 child was missing. A community wanted answers. And investigators were facing a crime scene that appeared to contain more questions than evidence. The cabin that had once represented safety for the Sharp family now held only uncertainty. Every object inside seemed capable of telling a story. Every detail demanded attention. Every unanswered question carried the weight of a family waiting for justice. Outside, Keddy remained surrounded by the same peaceful mountains that had always defined it. But inside cabin 28, the world had changed forever. The search for the truth had begun. And the deeper investigators looked into the events of that night, the more they would discover that the most frightening part of the case was not only what had happened. It was how many questions remained unanswered afterward. The first hours after the discovery of cabin 28 were filled with confusion. Investigators were not walking into a scene where every detail immediately pointed toward an obvious answer. They were entering a place where violence had left behind fragments of a story, but not the complete narrative. The cabin held evidence. But evidence does not speak. It requires interpretation. And in Keddy, every interpretation carried enormous consequences. The investigators who arrived that morning were confronted with a scene that suggested an intense and personal attack. This was not the kind of crime that appeared to be motivated simply by theft or opportunity. There were signs of a struggle. There were indications that the victims had been restrained. There were signs that the person or people responsible had remained inside the home long enough to create a scene of extreme violence. The brutality immediately raised one critical question. How many people had been involved? From the beginning, some investigators believed that more than one person may have participated in the attack. The reasoning was based on the circumstances surrounding the crime. Controlling multiple victims inside a small cabin, restraining them, and carrying out an assault of this nature would have been difficult for one person, especially while also preventing anyone from escaping or seeking help. But even that possibility created more questions. If there were multiple attackers, how did they know one another? Had they planned the crime together? Did they come to cabin 28 with a specific target in mind? Or had something happened inside the cabin that escalated beyond what anyone intended? Those questions would become central themes throughout the investigation. The victims themselves appeared to suggest that the attack had not been random. Sue Sharp was not an anonymous stranger. She was a mother. A neighbor. Someone who lived within a small community where relationships, conflicts, friendships, and personal histories overlapped. Investigators began examining the possibility that the killer or killers knew the family. The idea was unsettling. A stranger entering a remote cabin was frightening. But the possibility that someone familiar with the family could have entered that home was even more disturbing. Because familiarity creates access. A person known to the family would not necessarily attract suspicion. A familiar face would not automatically create fear. Someone who had visited before could understand the layout of the cabin, know the family's routines, and possibly know who would be present on a particular night. These possibilities transformed the investigation. The question was no longer simply, who committed this crime? It became, who could have entered this home without immediately causing alarm? The investigators also had to confront the mystery of Tina Sharp. Her disappearance separated this case from countless other homicide investigations. 3 victims had been found. 1 child was missing. And the absence of Tina created possibilities that were equally horrifying. If she had been taken, why? Was she selected because she had seen something? Was she targeted specifically? Was her disappearance connected to the murders, or was it part of a separate event? The search for Tina became an emotional and investigative priority. Her photograph was distributed. Questions were asked. Possibilities were considered. Every minute without an answer increased the fear surrounding her disappearance. For her family, uncertainty became its own form of suffering. A confirmed loss, no matter how painful, provides a terrible kind of finality. But not knowing creates a different kind of pain. It leaves room for hope and fear to exist at the same time. 4 years, the question remained. Where was Tina? Meanwhile, investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of the night. The problem was that time inside cabin 28 had become difficult to measure. The people who knew the sequence of events were gone. The surviving children were young. Memories from witnesses outside the cabin were incomplete. And the physical evidence, while disturbing, could not provide every answer. Investigators had to build a story from pieces. A statement here. A detail there. A remembered sound. A person who may have been seen nearby. A piece of evidence whose importance might not become clear until years later. This is the frustrating reality of many unsolved crimes. The truth does not disappear completely. It breaks apart. And investigators must try to rebuild it. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was the location itself. Keddie was isolated enough to provide privacy, but not so isolated that people were completely disconnected. Cabins were nearby. Neighbors existed. Yet somehow, an act of extraordinary violence had taken place without immediate discovery. That contradiction would trouble investigators for years. How long did the attack last? Did anyone hear anything? Did anyone see anything unusual? Was someone nearby who could have stopped it? The silence surrounding those questions became almost as disturbing as the crime itself. As investigators continued examining the scene, the image of cabin 28 began to change. It was no longer simply a home where a family had lived. It became a timeline. A collection of clues. A place where every object, every mark, and every missing detail represented a possible path toward the truth. But those paths did not lead investigators in a single direction. Instead, they created a complicated network of possibilities. Some led toward people connected to the Sharp family. Some led toward individuals already known to investigators. Some led nowhere at all. And as the investigation continued, suspicion began to focus on certain names. People who lived nearby. People who had connections to the family. People whose actions and statements raised questions. Among them was a man named Martin Smoot. His name would become one of the most frequently discussed in connection with the case. Smoot lived close to the Sharp family. He was not an unknown outsider who appeared from nowhere. He was part of the community surrounding Cabin 28. And over time, investigators would examine a series of details involving him that many considered suspicious. A missing hammer. Statements that appeared inconsistent. Allegations about conversations that may have occurred after the murders. Connections to others who also drew attention. None of these details alone would solve the case. But together, they created a shadow that would follow certain individuals for decades. Still, suspicion was not enough. A theory was not enough. Investigators needed evidence strong enough to stand in court. And that was where the Keddie investigation began to encounter its greatest obstacle. The difference between believing something happened and proving it happened. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure to find answers increased. A mother was dead. 2 teenagers were dead. A child remained missing. And a community wanted to know how such a tragedy could happen in a place they once believed was safe. The search for justice had begun. But the path ahead would be far more complicated than anyone expected. Because the Keddie cabin murders were not simply a case of finding a suspect. They were a case of determining which pieces of the story could be trusted. And which pieces had already been lost forever. The discovery of Cabin 28 did not simply reveal a crime. It revealed a mystery. When investigators first stepped inside the small wooden cabin on the morning of April 12, 1981, they were confronted with a scene that seemed to contain more questions than answers. The physical evidence told them that something horrific had occurred, but it did not immediately explain why. Every investigation begins with a moment of realization. The moment when a tragedy stops being a private nightmare and becomes a search for truth. For Keddie, that moment came when authorities understood that they were no longer dealing with a missing person or an unexplained disturbance. They were looking at a multiple homicide. And one child was still missing. The urgency was overwhelming. A family had been attacked inside their own home. The people responsible were unknown. The possibility that Tina Sharp might still be alive remained. Every second mattered. But from the very beginning, the investigation faced a problem that would become one of the defining issues of the case. The scene was already compromised. In modern criminal investigations, the first priority is preserving the environment exactly as it is found. Every object has potential value. Every footprint, every mark, every trace of biological material may become a crucial piece of evidence years later. A crime scene is not just a location. It is a moment frozen in time. But Cabin 28 was not treated with the level of protection that such a significant crime scene required. Before investigators had fully documented everything, people had already entered the area. Neighbors, family members, and others moved through the cabin during the chaotic first hours. The natural human response to tragedy, wanting to see, help, understand, or offer support, unintentionally created conditions that made later analysis more difficult. At the time, no one understood how important those early moments would become. No one knew that decades later, investigators would wish they could return to those first hours with modern techniques and a perfectly preserved scene. But time does not work backward. Evidence lost during those first moments cannot always be recovered. The cabin itself became a silent witness. The rooms held traces of what happened, but those traces required careful interpretation. Investigators examined the positions of objects, the condition of the room, and the physical signs of violence. The evidence suggested that the victims had experienced a prolonged and brutal attack rather than a sudden confrontation that ended within seconds. The scene indicated struggle. It suggested control. It suggested that the person or people responsible had time inside the cabin. That possibility made the case even more disturbing. This was not simply an impulsive act of violence that happened in a moment of panic. The evidence suggested a level of determination that investigators found deeply troubling. The weapons recovered from the scene added another layer to the investigation. A hammer and knives were identified as possible weapons connected to the attack. Their presence raised difficult questions about preparation and intent. Had the attacker arrived with weapons? Were objects inside the home used? Was the violence planned before anyone entered cabin 28? Or did the situation escalate after an unexpected confrontation? Each possibility created a different version of events. Each version required investigators to reconsider who might have been responsible. The condition of the victims also influenced early theories. The attack appeared personal. There were elements that suggested anger, control, and a desire to dominate the victims rather than simply harm them. That distinction mattered. Many crimes are committed for obvious reasons: theft, financial gain, revenge, or escape. But Cabin 28 did not immediately fit into any simple category. The investigators were searching for motive while still trying to understand the basic sequence of events. Why Sue? Why John? Why Dana? Why Tina? Why leave some children alive? These questions formed the foundation of the investigation. The surviving children became an essential part of understanding what happened. Rick, Greg, and Justin had been in the cabin that night. Their survival created both hope and confusion. They were among the few people who might have experienced something from inside the home. But they were also children. Their memories were shaped by age, fear, and the natural difficulty of processing a traumatic event. Investigators had to approach their accounts carefully. A child's memory is not the same as an adult's, especially after a terrifying experience. Details may appear and disappear. Certain moments may become clearer over time, while others may become uncertain. The challenge was determining which memories reflected what truly happened and which may have been influenced by fear, questions from adults, or the passage of time. The investigation also expanded beyond the walls of Cabin 28. Detectives began speaking with neighbors. They wanted to know who had been nearby, who had seen or heard anything unusual, who had visited the Sharp family recently, who might have had a reason to harm them. In a small community like Keddie, relationships mattered. People were not anonymous. Everyone had a history. Everyone had connections. That familiarity could help investigators. It could also complicate the search for answers. Because the person responsible might not have been a stranger hiding somewhere beyond the mountains. They might have been someone the community recognized. Someone whose presence did not immediately create suspicion. As detectives began collecting statements, they discovered that the case was becoming a puzzle built from incomplete pieces. Some witnesses remembered unusual events. Others remembered nothing. Some details seemed important immediately. Others only gained significance years later. The investigation had begun, but certainty remained distant. And while authorities searched for answers, one question continued to overshadow everything else. Where was Tina Sharp? The missing 12-year-old girl transformed the case from a devastating homicide into a national mystery. A missing child creates a different kind of urgency. Every possible explanation must be considered. Every lead must be followed. Every possibility, no matter how unlikely, must be examined. For the Sharp family, Tina's disappearance represented an unbearable uncertainty. They knew that something terrible had happened inside Cabin 28. But they did not know what had happened to her. They did not know whether she had escaped. They did not know whether someone had taken her. They did not know whether they would ever see her again. The investigation moved forward with that unanswered question at its center. And as detectives continued searching through evidence, interviews, and theories, The first clues began pointing toward people who lived close to the Sharp family. People who were not strangers. People whose names would remain connected to the case for decades. The search for the truth had only begun. But already, investigators were discovering something unsettling. The greatest challenge would not be finding possible suspects. It would be proving what happened in a case where so much had already been lost. As investigators continued examining Cabin 28, the crime scene began to reveal a disturbing picture. The violence had not been random. The victims had not simply been caught in a sudden act of chaos. The evidence suggested a deliberate attack carried out inside a place that should have represented safety. A home. A family space. A place where children slept. The more detectives studied the scene, the more they became convinced that whoever entered Cabin 28 had understood one important thing: the people inside were vulnerable. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. The question was no longer only about what happened. It was about who could have known enough about the family to make such a devastating attack possible. The layout of Cabin 28 became a central part of understanding the crime. It was not a large house. The rooms were connected closely enough that movement between them would have been relatively easy. Sounds could travel. A person entering one part of the cabin could potentially move through the home quickly. That raised one of the most troubling mysteries. How could such a violent attack happen while 3 children remained alive in another room? The survival of Rick, Greg, and Justin became one of the strongest contradictions in the entire case. In many investigations, the presence of surviving witnesses provides clarity. Here, it created more uncertainty. Their survival meant there were people who had been inside the cabin during the attack. But it also meant investigators had to understand why they were spared. Was it intentional? Did the attacker know the children were there? Were they asleep the entire time? Or did something happen that prevented the violence from reaching them? Every possibility carried disturbing implications. If the killer or killers knew the children were present and chose not to harm them, that suggested planning and control. If they did not know, it suggested a different sequence of events. Either way, the unanswered question remained. Why them? The investigation also focused heavily on the timeline. Reconstructing the hours between the evening of April 11th and the morning of April 12th became one of the most important tasks facing detectives. But building that timeline was extremely difficult. There were no surviving adult witnesses inside the main room where the attack occurred. The victims could not describe the events. The surviving children were young. Neighbors had limited information. And the early handling of the scene meant some details that might have helped establish a timeline were no longer available with certainty. Detectives were forced to work backward. They examined what was left behind and attempted to determine what must have happened before those final moments. A struggle. Restraints. Weapons. The disappearance of Tina. Each element suggested a story. But the story remained incomplete. One of the most important early discoveries was the use of restraints. The fact that victims appeared to have been tied suggested that the attacker or attackers had taken steps to control the situation. This was not simply a matter of overpowering someone physically. It involved an additional level of domination. For investigators, this detail carried psychological significance. It suggested patience. It suggested intention. It suggested that the person responsible had a purpose beyond immediate violence. Criminal investigators often study not only what offenders do, but how they do it. The method can reveal something about the person behind the crime. The choices made. The risks taken. The level of planning involved. In Cabin 28, those choices created a disturbing portrait. Someone had entered a family home and transformed it into a scene of terror. Yet despite the brutality, that person or those people left behind unanswered questions instead of clear answers. The disappearance of Tina became the largest of those questions. Search efforts began immediately. The surrounding area was examined. Possible routes away from the cabin were considered. Investigators tried to determine whether Tina had left voluntarily or whether she had been taken. Her age made every possibility more complicated. At 12 years old, Tina was old enough to understand danger but still young enough to be vulnerable. She was not a toddler who could disappear unnoticed, but she was also not an adult capable of easily protecting herself. Her disappearance suggested a connection between the murders and whatever happened afterward. The question was whether Tina was taken because of something she knew, something she witnessed, or because she was specifically targeted. The possibility that she had seen the attack was especially troubling. A child who witnessed a violent crime could represent a threat to someone trying to escape responsibility. But investigators also had to consider other possibilities. Perhaps Tina was not taken during the attack. Perhaps something else happened after the murders. Perhaps her disappearance was connected to motives that investigators had not yet discovered. Without answers, every theory remained possible. As the investigation expanded, detectives began looking closely at people connected to the Sharp family. In small communities, relationships create invisible networks. Friends, neighbors, acquaintances, people who visited casually, people who knew routines, people who might have information. One of the names that began receiving attention was Martin Smoot. Smoot lived near the Sharp family and was connected to the community surrounding Cabin 28. His name would eventually become one of the most discussed in relation to the case. Several details attracted investigators' interest. A missing hammer. Statements that raised questions. Reports of unusual behavior after the murders. Connections to another man, John Bubaid, who would also become associated with theories surrounding the case. But early suspicion created a difficult problem. A person can appear suspicious without being guilty. A strange statement is not the same as proof. A rumor is not the same as evidence. Investigators understood this distinction, but the public often did not. As information about the case spread, theories multiplied quickly. People wanted answers. They wanted someone responsible. They wanted the fear surrounding Cabin 28 to have a name. But criminal investigations cannot be built on what feels likely. They must be built on what can be proven. And proving what happened inside Cabin 28 would become increasingly difficult as time passed. The first days became weeks. Weeks became months. The initial urgency surrounding the murders slowly transformed into frustration. The case remained open. The questions remained. Tina remained missing. For the Sharp family, every passing day without answers carried another layer of pain. For investigators, every passing day created another challenge. Memories began changing. Witnesses remembered details differently. Evidence became harder to analyze. The possibility of solving the case seemed to move further away. Yet the investigation was not over. Some clues had not yet been discovered. Some statements had not yet been fully examined. And some secrets connected to Cabin 28 had not yet surfaced. The case was entering a new phase. A phase where suspicion would intensify, theories would compete, and investigators would follow paths that sometimes led closer to the truth and sometimes into complete dead ends. Because in the Keddy Cabin murders, the mystery was never simply about what happened. It was about why so many pieces of the truth remained hidden.